Hi, my name's Stephen Russell. I'm a policy officer in the International Department of the Trades Union Congress, one of the founding organisations of the Ethical Trading Initiative. We do a lot of work supporting unions around the world, and as part of my role covering our business and human rights agenda, and within that issues surrounding global supply chains, I've been lucky enough to work with a lot of Latin American unions, including our friends in Guatemala in the banana industry. And their story is the one I'd like to tell you about today. There'll be lots of photos here which I took on my last visit to Guatemala. They're not always absolutely relevant to the story I'm telling, but hopefully they just give you a little flavour of the people we're talking about. As a starting point, I quickly wanted to talk about one of the basics we find ourselves confronting when we look at global supply chains. The majority of the supply chains of Western brands that end in countries around the world end in countries that have one of three models of labour control, labour repression. That's the way in which employers or government or any actors in the economy keep costs low, which of course makes them very attractive to people looking to source their goods. State party is the problem we have, say, in China and Vietnam, where the labour movement is essentially co-opted by the governing party or the state, so that there's no room for independent action of workers, and that makes achieving workers' rights very difficult in that scenario. Despotic market is the term used to describe an essential absence of enforcement or workers' rights, or a lack of organisation amongst labour groups that allow them to push back, negotiate, campaign for rights and seek enforcement. Bangladesh would be a good example of that. The one we're going to talk about today gets classed as repressive employer. These countries officially have decent labour rights, but there is a problem with enforcement, and employers have developed counter strategies against sometimes strong, sometimes not so strong unions that involve intimidation, violence and other means of stopping unions being able to be viable partners in a negotiating process. One of the problems that Central America has is low union density, and we're going to be talking about Guatemala, which went from a relatively healthy position many years ago to being the lowest in the region. Guatemala had a civil war that only ended in the late 90s, but since then, for the labour movement, the struggle has continued, including not just a metaphorical struggle, but actual violence at the hands of soldiers, former soldiers, and dispossessed paramilitaries. That post-war period for Guatemala's unions was an intense one. There were hopes all round that an end to the fighting might bring a better life for everybody, but in 1999, SITRABI, who are Guatemala's oldest private sector union and have been around in some form or other since the 1950s, had a collective bargaining agreement with their major plantation owner in the north of the country where they're based. There was a failure in the relationship. The company was refusing to honour terms of the collective bargaining agreement, and a strike was called. But before it could start, a group of 200 paramilitaries stormed the union offices and kidnapped the executive. Two of them were then driven to a local radio station, where at gunpoint they were forced to call off the strike, denounce the union, and at the end of that process they and the other members of the executive were told if they didn't leave the country, and leave the country by going further than Mexico, which was an odd little detail they were given, they would be killed. Understandably, the executive packed their bags, left the country, and have been living in the United States ever since. So an entirely new generation of leaders of the union had to take over with very little experience, very little training, and to make sense of a situation that didn't seem to make any sense at all, where all the power and influence they tried to build up as a respected partner of the employer was gone in a flash. This created an ongoing cycle of industrial unrest and further violence over the following 15 years. Union strikes, when they happened, were met with further employer violence. When either party turned to the government to intervene and fix things, they did nothing. The union would approach the government over the issue of the kidnappings and other violent crimes, but these people were able to operate with total impunity. No prosecutions were brought over the perpetrators of the kidnapping, and in the very grim period that followed, trade unions across Guatemala were targeted, and between 2007 and 2014, 68 trade unionists were killed. Of those, 12 were members of this same union, making it one of the most persecuted individual unions anywhere in the world. Of those 68 murders, not one single person was prosecuted for the crime. Lots of work has been going on recently to do something about that, but as we start our story, we still are in a position of total impunity for crimes against trade unionists. Clearly, something needs to be done to break this cycle. As I said, these are some of the guys I met when I visited Guatemala in 2014, all of whom had a similar story to tell about how difficult it was to ask for their rights, get through a day's work with any kind of hope that tomorrow will be a better day for them. 12 of their friends and colleagues killed. Most, I won't say most tragically, but sort of most notoriously, this included the brother of the current General Secretary. His name was Marco Tulio Ramirez, and he was gunned down leaving the union offices in 2007. 2 weeks earlier, soldiers had stormed the offices looking for him. The union had gone to the government saying, this is a terrible problem, we're really scared for our friend, what are you going to do to protect him? And of course, they did nothing. 2 weeks later, he was dead. What SITRABI did that makes this a remarkable story of hope rather than just a grim one of resilience in the face of oppression was they recognized that with three parties engaged in this cycle of violence, one person or one group was required to make a change to change the dynamic of that cycle. You couldn't wait for everyone to do it because the timing would be too difficult. You can't just sit back and expect the government and the employers to one day wake up and have a revelation that something needs to be done at exactly the same time as you. So I think it was, I can't remember who said, be the change you want to see in the world. So I've messed that quote up, but essentially this was the vision that Noé, who was already engaged in a campaign to get justice for his brother, realized that it was equally important to make sure that this didn't happen again to them as a union and their friends in the north of Guatemala. Now, the way they went about this was to look at all the points on the circle and see where those changes needed to be. Clearly, the company needed to change its mind about the union. They needed to see a human face on the trade union, not an enemy. Clearly, the government needed to be brought into this to change its laissez-faire attitude towards the violence. But of course, the union itself, in order to achieve those things, needed to have a think about what it was doing, what its long-term goals were, and how it would achieve them. So they started with that change themselves, and they engaged in a process of systematic union education. And to do that, they reached out to their friends in the international trade union movement and NGOs to get the best ideas on how they might move forward. One of the first things we at the TUC were able to do was link them up with our trade union education experts, but also to provide them with further funding to get local experts on the ground to help them develop new approaches to negotiation. The point being that they couldn't just keep confronting employer violence. I mean, I should say there was, for years, there was a long-standing industrial relations response to any problem from the employer. The plantations in the north of Guatemala are broken up into different employers, all of whom inherited them after the end of the old United Fruit Companies, which was one of the employers that gave the name to the term banana republics, because they were such mighty corporations, they essentially ran the government. But they were disbanded and different companies took over different plantations. SITRABI organising the biggest plantations, but there are other unions organising some of the smaller plantations, all in the same old expanse of plantation land. There's only one access road to all these different places, and whenever each of the companies upset its particular union, the union would go, put down a barricade and block the access road. The problem with that, of course, while very effective in terms of getting the attention of the company you're in a dispute with, it annoyed all the other companies who, while overall they were normally doing some bad stuff, might not have been doing anything particularly bad right then, but it meant that their experience of union unrest was multiplied in a way that most employers would never see. So they couldn't just be in control of their relationship with their union, because if their neighbours fell out with their union, everything stopped. So you couldn't get the bananas off the plantation, and as we know about bananas, they're very time-specific fruit. If you have a delay of a couple of days, you've pretty much spoiled a lot of your crop. So changing the way they negotiated, but also crucially changing the way their partner unions on the other plantations negotiated, was clearly going to be an important thing in changing the levels of hostility they were getting off the employer. The other thing they had a problem with is genuine representation of the whole workforce. Now, on a banana plantation, the groves of banana plants are normally tended, harvested, and looked after by men. And they were the people that pretty much founded the union. They had all the important jobs in the union, and they dominated the membership. But another crucial part of the whole operation is in the packing and distribution centres. So they have something called a packhouse, where the bananas arrive on a sort of train of hooks. They're sliced off, put in pools to be washed, collected, sorted into different sizes, stamped with a company sticker, put in boxes. Now, dominating these packhouses is a female workforce. But for some reason, over the course of the years, fewer of those women had joined the union, and therefore fewer of them had positions of responsibility in the union. Now, SITRABI recognised, partially because it knew it needed maximum legitimacy when facing down its hostile employer, that it needed to bring those women into the union, but not merely sign them up as members, but to make sure that they rose through the ranks, became negotiators, became organisers, became officials. So part of their union education programme, which we co-funded and helped develop, was reaching out to women workers, encouraging them to join, identifying the best potential leaders from amongst those, and targeting education at them so that they could take important roles in the union. And as I said, one of the fundamentals to this was SITRABI couldn't act alone, but they needed all the unions and all the plantations to sign up to the same strategy. And so clearly the best way to do that was to offer this training free of charge, involve them in the design of the program, and make them feel that it wasn't something being done to them, which is always one of the most fundamental things for dealing with a union. You let the union come up with as much of it themselves, and you'll get maximum buy-in. So, the union's now full of high-class negotiators. It's fully democratized its ranks and its upper echelons. That's great. So you've got a better union. What's got to happen now? They could have gone straight to the employers at this point, but the employers were the source of the worst problems, so they thought they'd get all their ducks in a row first, or bananas on a hook, or I don't know, whatever the phrase would be. So what they decided to do next was look at a genuine tripartite approach, engaging the government in this, but also using that to start giving the message to the employers that a violent reaction this would be unacceptable, ending impunity generally and progressing their campaign for justice, but also seeing what other mechanisms might exist out there to put pressure on all players in the situation. So they engaged with the Ministry of Labour particularly. Now there have been a lot of ministers of labour over this course of time. None of them were particularly stellar, but slowly they wore them down to the extent that they started to agree to come to meetings between the union and the company. One of the ways they made sure that happened was reaching out to their partners in the international trade union movement to put pressure on the mechanisms that we have access to, most particularly the International Labour Organization, the ILO. But that couldn't have happened if SITRABI hadn't developed its own position, reformed its structures, and really put itself out in the forefront. Because, as you can imagine, there are a lot of labour issues in the world right now. The ILO can only look at a few. The workers' group inside the ILO, because the ILO being tripartite, has a genuine voice for workers inside it, as well as for governments and employers. If you're going to choose Guatemala, you've got to have a good reason to do it. So, having gone through that period of self-improvement, SITRABI were in a really good place to come to the international unions and say, can you help us? And so they did, and they made Guatemala one of their target countries for the next few years, with a number of cases being taken to the various mechanisms inside the ILO that hold governments to account and give them instructions on how to fix the problems in their countries. So with that in the background, the government knows when Noe and his SITRABI committee come to meet him, it's not just the union talking to him, it's the union as a representative of international workers being watched by workers and the institutions that they cooperate with. But finally, this is the crux of the matter, if you don't fix the relationship with the employers, this was all for nothing. Now, using their training and their heightened negotiating skills, they recognise that the barricade to the access road, while a very final fix for drastic problems, wasn't really building the kind of relationship they needed. And so they all agreed collectively, not just within SITRABI but within the other unions, that the blockades should be an absolute last resort and that they would use their newfound knowledge to negotiate and use different tactics. They reached out to create a sector roundtable. This was something that had never happened in the Guatemalan banana industry, but it was absolutely crucial to the idea of sitting around a table with the employers, with the government as a potential honest broker to lend the appropriate level of respectability to the process, but really humanise the relationship between the union and employers that really not that long ago had been asking its thugs to sort out the issue of union arguments. Using that, they used their skills to launch on their programme of effective negotiation. And the simple fact is, it worked. It took a while to drag all the employers to the table, but once you got one of them to come, the others eventually realised that they needed to be there as well. They sat round a table, they negotiated with the unions, they signed new collective bargaining agreements. And these collective bargaining agreements included, as all the best ones do, a bit of give and take. There were better conditions for the workers, better hours, more safety equipment, more access to social protection, all the things that had really been a major problem. Clearly the collective bargaining agreement didn't include a promise not to kill anyone, because oddly the company never actually admitted it had done that. But the fundamentals that had caused the breakdown in the relationship that made the violence inevitable were addressed in that agreement. And in return, SITRABI agreed to productivity improvements, and the union collectively signed up to a process of trying to make sure the plantation could survive in a competitive world where most of the other plantations around Guatemala have no unionization whatsoever. Whenever something goes wrong, and it still goes wrong, they were able to tap back into solidarity actions with their friends around the world. The Italians were backing them, the American unions, the Canadian unions, we were. And so we would write to the employer reminding them of the agreement and urge them not to backslide into the kind of relationship they had before. And that kept the employers honest as well. So the international aspect for the union was very important. Key lessons from our story here. It was the union themselves that really recognised that they needed to take the steps to change it. Now, in any cycle, it just takes one group to break out of that cycle and change it. But for the kind of problem we had here, I think the union recognising its own needs in terms of change and development, democratisation, skill in the negotiating room, was the best of all possible options. It was the one way you were going to break this cycle and transform the agenda. It meant the employers had to take them seriously. It meant they could reach out to the government. It meant that they could bring the eyes of the world and the other trade unions and the ILO onto them to see something genuinely exciting happening that deserved the support of everyone, and that enabled extra pressure to go on the points that needed shifting in the cycle. As well as international structures, they used all the regional structures they could. There was a regional banana union consortium, I don't quite know what they call themselves, called CIBA, and they were able to provide regional advice, best practice, link them in with people that could help them on their journey of development and up their skills. And finally, as part of all that, and important from the ETI's definition of tripartism, there was a good NGO working with them that really understood their needs, knew that the purpose was to let the union lead, to bring them advice and guidance and nurture them wherever possible, but also to back away and give them room when they needed it. It changed the culture of hostility with the employers. As I said, in the 7 years prior to the launch of this program, 7 members of the union had been murdered. In the 4 years since, not one person has died. As I have reflected when giving this presentation before, it may feel like a low bar, but when you're talking about that level of hostility, I'm sad to say that nobody died, stops being a kind of minimum gain and becomes a triumph. There is unity now amongst the separate unions. Indeed, because SITRABI never tried to boss the game, never tried to be in charge, but always consulted, worked with them, gave them things rather than forcing them on, actually the kind of competition that existed originally between them has pretty much gone, and SITRABI are now seen as the leader of the unions. So by not seeking to be in control, they have ended up in a positive leadership role. They've continued to use international levers. Just last year, the ILO's governing body agreed with the Guatemalan government for a new roadmap towards better labour relations, and they are convening a tripartite committee that will have the full support of the government, brings chief employers in the area and the unions to a table for regular talks to oversee implementation of a number of reforms, and that committee is overseen by the ILO directly. So although often we'd say, well, the problem is in this scenario, the employers and the government probably agree with each other a little bit too much, which means the tripartite balance isn't really there, they'll know if they try to use that to exploit things and slow things down and not deliver the reforms that are needed, that they'll just end up in trouble with the ILO again. So it's a good settlement for now, and it keeps the pressure right on them. And it's a local solution with national and regional implications, which again makes it very exciting for the rest of us, because it has applicability. We can see what they did there and applied in other areas, but also the rest of the country has very low rates of unionisation. Central America has relatively low rates of unionisation. Eventually, these things are going to be a problem for the union movement and therefore for workers' rights and conditions on the ground. By showing they can fix this problem, they make it easier to spread better news about trade unionism around the region and maybe, who knows, around the world, so that you can build better conditions for those workers and make it easier for themselves as a union to survive going forward. I've always wondered why people say going forward, and I've just revealed it. It's because they can't think of anything else to say and they've got to the end of a sentence. So that's why I just used it. Right, finally, persistence. In the 15 years between that kidnapping and the results, for the first half of that, they got nowhere. There were people trying to kill them. There were constant strikes and arguments, no help from the government. But 15 years later, they had the beginnings of a deal And a few years later on, it's still holding, still bringing progress, and still a very exciting opportunity. Now, the legacy is pretty simple, really. They get on better with their fellow unions, and they also have the support of unions around the world. It humanized the face of trade unions, and perhaps, I haven't actually asked them this, I haven't flipped it, I haven't said, has it humanized the face of the employer? Does that change the way you deal with them? Because I've only really thought of it from the other way around, but it probably has. But certainly, that's the key to no more threats and violence, because everyone around that table is a human being and has a certain level of respect for each other. It enhanced the reputation of their union, but it's enhancing the reputation of unions generally in Guatemala and wherever this story has been told. They now have a generation of skilled and experienced union reps who can not only continue to fix the problems that present themselves there in northern Guatemala, but could be applied anywhere where this is useful for the movement. And that comes to the increased capacity to take on new challenges. I won't talk about it now, but I will say that SITRABI, having saved themselves, are looking around Guatemala and seeing what it is they can do to boost trade unionism and protect workers' rights around the country and the region, using everything they've learned from their own experience. I want to make one final point, and that was back on the NGO. I think one of the things that I most respect about the NGO that helped SITRABI with this was quite late on in the process, just a couple of years ago, the idea of expanding that industry round table into something bigger occurred, and negotiations were underway to launch a regional banana forum. Now, the NGO, Banana Link, played a strong role in setting that up, and just as they were about to launch it, the employers' groups asked Banana Link to take the seat reserved for the workers. And they said, no, that's not what we're here to do. We've helped you get it going. That is a worker's seat. You need genuine worker representatives. So what we will do, we will come to your first meeting with SITRABI if you promise that at the second meeting, it's only SITRABI, and they have the seat as the leading regional union in this particular industry. The employers back down, and that's the way the agreement has gone forward. And that is the way to create room as an NGO for unions to work, as well as all the lessons we may have about room given by employers for freedom of association. Thank you very much.